It was a dark time for Israel. The people had once again broken their sacred agreement with the Lord, and divine judgment rose like a tide from the sea. God delivered them into the hands of the Philistines, fearsome warriors from the coast, infamous for their brutality and possessing a terrifying advantage, the secret of ironworking. While the Israelites still fought with bronze, the Philistines wielded swords that were harder, sharper, and far more lethal. These ruthless Philistines captured the descendants of Abraham, pillaged their fields, and for 40 long, agonizing years, they humiliated and enslaved the people of Israel. But God doesn't forsake his people. In a forgotten village within the territory of the tribe of Dan, within the barren womb of a woman, God was preparing an answer, a solution to their suffering. From this unlikely place, from this apparent weakness, would be born a man destined to alter the course of history, Samson. This is the story of Israel's most feared judge, a man who could tear a lion apart with his bare hands, slay 1,000 men, and collapse an entire temple using nothing but his incredible strength. However, it's also the story of his downfall, his tragic undoing. Samson was, after all, only human, and he possessed a significant weakness: women. His greatest struggle wasn't against the Philistines themselves, but against his own inner demons, against the pride that ultimately cost him everything, until he finally realized that his faith was his greatest, most potent weapon. In a village nestled in the hills of the tribe of Dan, there lived a man named Manoah and his wife. They were a simple, unassuming couple, but they carried a deep, abiding sorrow within their hearts. They were unable to have children. In those days, childlessness was viewed as a profound disgrace, as if their lives were somehow incomplete, lacking a fundamental purpose. The woman's pain mirrored a larger problem. Israel, God's chosen people, was also seemingly without hope, a barren nation oppressed by its enemies. One day, while the woman was alone working in the field, a brilliant, blinding light suddenly surrounded her. An angel appeared and shared news that would forever change her life. "You are barren and childless," the angel said, "but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son. Now, listen carefully. I urge you, drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing that is considered unclean. You will become pregnant and have a son whose head must never be touched by a razor, because this boy will be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the moment he is born. And he will begin the process of delivering Israel from the grasp of the Philistines." The woman, still trembling with a mixture of awe and fear, ran to tell her husband everything that had happened. Filled with both wonder and a sense of trepidation, he asked God to send the angel back so that they could fully comprehend everything they needed to do in order to prepare for this miraculous child. And God heard his prayer. God's angel appeared again and repeated the message, emphasizing that they would have a son who must adhere to the Nazirite vow. Being a Nazirite meant taking a very special, solemn oath to God. It signified that a person would be completely and utterly dedicated to his service. To fulfill this promise, the child would be required to follow a few very important specific rules. He must never drink wine or any similar alcoholic beverage. He must never touch anything considered unclean or ritually impure, and above all else, he must never cut his hair. Manoah, filled with reverence and deep gratitude, prepared an offering for God, a sacrifice on a rock. And then, something truly incredible, something miraculous occurred. As the fire from the sacrifice rose toward the heavens, the angel of the Lord ascended with the flame and vanished from their sight. Manoah, terrified by what he had witnessed, said to his wife, "We are surely going to die because we have seen God." But his wife, filled with unwavering faith, replied, "If God had intended to kill us, he wouldn't have accepted our gift. He wouldn't have told us these wonderful things or made us this extraordinary promise." And so, from barrenness came the promise of new life. From that humble woman was born a child destined from the womb to deliver God's chosen people. His name was not a mere coincidence, it was a prophecy. Samson means little sun, because in the midst of the darkness of Philistine oppression, he would be the ray of light announcing the dawn of liberation. From his earliest childhood, Samson was different from other children. The Spirit of God began to stir within him, endowing him with incredible strength that defied all explanation. With each passing year, his muscles grew stronger, but an even greater battle raged within his soul. Part of him yearned to obey God and fulfill the purpose for which he had been born, but another part of him simply wanted to be a normal young man, free to indulge in whatever desires and whims he pleased. This internal conflict, this constant struggle between obeying God's will and following his own earthly desires, would accompany him throughout his life and would very soon bring him a great deal of trouble and hardship. As Samson matured into a young man, everyone in Israel knew of his almost unbelievable strength, but they also knew of his impulsiveness, his recklessness. They knew that he often acted without thinking, allowing himself to be swept away by whatever he happened to be feeling at the moment. One day, he traveled to a Philistine city called Timnah, and there he saw a beautiful Philistine woman. The Philistines were the enemies of the people of Israel, the ones who had oppressed and colonized them, and they didn't adhere to God's laws. But Samson didn't care that she was a Philistine. He simply saw her, and in that instant he decided that she had to be his wife. When he returned home, he told his parents, "I saw a woman in Timnah, one of the Philistine daughters. Get her for me to be my wife." His parents were utterly stunned by this announcement and said to him with deep concern, "Isn't there a woman among your own people, among all of our relatives, that you must go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" Samson's parents knew that marrying a Philistine woman was incredibly dangerous. It could easily lead him to break his covenant, his sacred agreement with God. But logic and reason didn't work with Samson. His answer was blunt and unwavering. "Get her for me. She's the one I want." To everyone observing the situation, it appeared to be nothing more than the reckless whim of a headstrong young man. But what no one realized was that this seemingly impulsive act was actually the very first piece of God's intricate plan for Samson's divinely ordained mission. Samson and his parents then set out on the road to Timnah. At one point along the way, Samson veered off the main path and ventured into a place that was particularly dangerous for him, a vineyard. As a Nazirite, Samson was bound by 3 primary prohibitions. He couldn't drink wine, he couldn't touch anything unclean, and he couldn't cut his hair. Suddenly, the tranquility of the vineyard was shattered by a terrifying sound. A deep, blood-curdling roar echoed through the vines. From the thick undergrowth, a young lion leaped out, strong, hungry, and heading directly for him. Samson stood alone, without a sword or shield, completely unarmed and vulnerable in the face of almost certain death. But in that precise moment, the Spirit of God came upon him, and supernatural strength surged through every fiber of his being. Fear instantly vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of power. Samson grabbed the lion and, with his bare hands, tore it apart as easily as if it were a young goat. No one witnessed this incredible feat, and Samson didn't tell anyone about what had occurred. But later, when he was returning to marry the woman, he went back to the place where he had killed the lion. He approached the dead animal's carcass and saw something truly astonishing. Inside the carcass, a swarm of bees had built a honeycomb filled with honey. Samson reached in, scooped out the honey, and ate it as he walked along the road. He even gave some to his parents, but he didn't tell them that the honey had come from the dead lion's body. But this seemingly insignificant act was actually a very serious transgression. As a Nazirite, Samson wasn't supposed to touch anything unclean, especially not the corpse of an animal. Deep down, Samson was testing the limits of his calling, disobeying God's commands, and seeing just how far he could push the boundaries without losing God's blessing. Samson's wedding day finally arrived, and, as was the Philistine custom, the celebration would be a grand feast lasting a full 7 days. There was an abundance of food and drink, and music filled the air. 30 young Philistine men were chosen to accompany Samson and serve as his companions. But this grand feast was also like a trap being set for Samson. It's crucial to remember that Samson had taken a vow to live differently, to abstain from excesses such as drinking too much wine. Yet, Samson was determined to impress everyone and to show off his cleverness, so he challenged them with a riddle. In a booming voice, he announced to the 30 Philistines, "Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. If you can solve this riddle during these 7 days of the feast, I'll give you 30 fine garments and 30 sets of clothes. But if you can't figure it out, you'll have to give them to me." Everyone was deeply intrigued and began puzzling over the riddle. 3 entire days passed, but no one could come up with the answer. The men grew increasingly nervous and desperate. On the 4th day, they made a cruel and underhanded decision. They went to threaten Samson's wife. They told her, "Get your husband to tell us the answer to the riddle, or we'll burn you and your father's house to the ground. Did you invite us here just to rob us and leave us impoverished?" The woman, terrified by their threats, went to confront her husband, and weeping against his chest, she said, "You hate me, you don't love me. You've given my people a riddle, and you haven't even explained it to me." Samson snapped back harshly, "I haven't even told my own father or mother the answer. Why would I tell it to you?" But she wouldn't stop crying, and every single day that remained of the feast, she kept at him relentlessly, pressuring him to reveal the secret. Samson held out for as long as he possibly could. But on the 7th day, worn down by her constant nagging and emotional manipulation, he finally revealed the answer. She immediately ran to tell her people, and before the sun went down, the Philistines gave Samson the answer to the riddle. What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? Samson felt utterly betrayed by her deception. Glaring at them with rage, he shot back, "If you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you never would have solved my riddle." With these words, Samson was accusing them of using his wife to extract the answer, just as a farmer uses an animal to plow a field. The game had turned into a humiliating defeat, a terrible disgrace for him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him with incredible power, and filled with fury, he went down to Ashkelon, a Philistine city. There he killed 30 men, stripped them of their clothes, and gave them to those who had solved the riddle. Furious and deeply wounded by his wife's betrayal, he returned to his father's house. As the days passed, Samson's anger gradually cooled, and he decided to try and reconcile with his wife. He walked to her house carrying a young goat as a peace offering. But when he arrived, his father-in-law slammed the door in his face and said, "I truly thought you hated her. That's why I gave her to your companion. But look, her younger sister is more beautiful than she is. Take her instead." Samson's composure shattered completely. The woman he had chosen, the very reason he had ventured into enemy territory in the first place, had been handed over to another man as if she were nothing more than a piece of property. His humiliation transformed into an ice-cold fury. And through clenched teeth he declared, "This time I'll be blameless when I inflict harm upon the Philistines." The offense wasn't just against him personally. It was against his honor and ultimately against his God. The Philistines would pay dearly for this transgression, but how could one man possibly punish an entire nation? Then Samson devised a plan that was as strange as it was destructive. He went out to hunt foxes, or more precisely, jackals, and captured 300 of them. He tied them together by their tails, 2 by 2, and fastened a burning torch between each pair of animals. Then he released them into the Philistine fields. Within minutes, the fire spread like a devouring monster. The result was apocalyptic. Flames raged through the crops, vineyards burned, wheat fields were consumed, and even the olive groves were completely destroyed. The impact was absolutely devastating. An entire year's harvest, the land that sustained the Philistines, vanished in a single night of smoke and flames. When the Philistines saw the utter destruction, they demanded to know who had done such a thing. And the answer came quickly. It was Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because the man had given his wife to his companion. Filled with rage, the Philistines sought revenge. They went to the Timnite's house and set it ablaze, burning Samson's wife and her father alive. The news hit Samson like a crushing blow. The woman who had started it all, the love that had brought him to Timnah in the first place, had died because of him, and in the cruelest way imaginable. His grief transformed into a burning thirst for revenge, and he swore before heaven, "Since you have done this to me, I swear I will have my vengeance upon you, and only then will I be satisfied." And Samson kept his word. He fell upon them like a storm, unleashing his incredible strength in a merciless slaughter. The air filled with screams, and the ground was littered with corpses. After the massacre, Samson withdrew, exhausted and with his heart still burning with rage, and sought refuge in the cave at the rock of Etam. But the Philistines wouldn't let such an offense go unpunished. They marched against Judah and made camp in the region of Lehi. The men of Judah, terrified by the Philistines' presence, asked, "Why have you come up against us?" They answered plainly, "We have come to capture Samson and to do to him as he has done to us." The message struck the hearts of the Israelites like an iron blow. Samson had provoked a war that they were simply unwilling to fight. They weren't thinking about freedom from oppression, they were thinking solely about survival. So they decided to take action. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cave at the rock of Etam, where Samson was hiding. 3,000 of his own brothers, sent not to support him, but to hand him over to the enemy. When they found him, they looked at him with reproach and said, "Don't you realize that the Philistines rule over us? What have you done to us?" To them, Samson wasn't a liberator or a hero, but a problem, a troublemaker. His strength had ignited the Philistines' wrath, and his own people, instead of rising up alongside him, had chosen to subdue him in order to save their own necks. Samson looked at them and answered coldly, "I only did to them what they did to me." But the men of Judah didn't stop there. "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines." Samson could have easily defeated them right there, but understanding that this was somehow part of God's plan, and seeing the depth of his people's fear, he agreed to be bound. He asked only one thing, that they not kill him themselves. They swore to this condition, tied him with 2 new ropes, and led him from the rock to deliver him to his enemies. When they reached Lehi, the Philistines shouted in triumph. They believed that they finally had in their hands the man who had devastated their fields and humiliated their armies. But in that instant, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson with overwhelming power. Suddenly, the ropes binding him became like burnt flax, and they fell from his arms as if they had never existed. Samson looked around desperately for a weapon, and the only thing he could find was a jawbone. The jawbone of a donkey that had recently died. He gripped it tightly and began to fight with unparalleled ferocity. Dust rose up in swirling clouds, screams filled the air, and Philistines fell one after another, cut down by his unrelenting assault. With a simple donkey's bone, Samson killed 1,000 men. The field was littered with corpses, and he, panting with exhaustion, raised his voice and declared, "With a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men." When the battle finally ended, Samson was utterly exhausted, so tired and thirsty that he was on the verge of collapse, and he cried out desperately to God, "You have given me this great victory. Will I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of those who don't know you?" Suddenly, a crack opened in the ground, and water began to flow from it. Samson drank deeply, regained his strength, and felt alive once again. That's why the place was called En Hakore, which means the spring of the one who called out. After that great victory, Samson officially became a judge of Israel. For the next 20 years, Samson led his people. The Philistines feared him, and though they still ruled the land, they couldn't rest easy, knowing that at any moment Samson might strike again. The more famous Samson became, the more the Philistines hated him. His exploits had made him public enemy number one, a ghost who appeared where they least expected him and left a trail of destruction in his wake. But Samson still possessed the same fatal weakness: women. One night, he went down to Gaza, one of the most important and heavily fortified Philistine cities. There, he sought out a prostitute and spent the night with her. It was a reckless act, walking directly into the heart of enemy territory, into a walled city crawling with soldiers, just to satisfy a fleeting desire. Word that Samson was in Gaza spread like wildfire. The Philistines locked the city gates and posted guards at every entrance, convinced that they had him cornered. "Let's wait until dawn," they said. "Then we'll kill him." They were certain that when daybreak came, Samson would fall right into their trap. But Samson didn't wait for dawn. He rose at midnight and went straight to the gates that protected the city. They were massive wooden gates, reinforced with giant posts and iron bars, designed to be impenetrable. But Samson ripped them right out of the ground with his bare hands. The weight was staggering, probably over 800 pounds. But Samson hoisted the entire structure onto his shoulders and walked for miles until he reached Hebron, an Israelite city perched high in the mountains. There, he planted the gates like a trophy, a silent and humiliating message to his enemies. The Philistine walls couldn't stop him. Their security was an illusion, and not even the most heavily guarded city could hold back the man that God had raised up. The news spread like wildfire. For the Israelites, it was a powerful reminder that God was still with their judge. For the Philistines, it was the ultimate mockery. They had lost the gates that symbolized their strength and their pride, and with them, they had lost their honor. But this spectacular and humiliating display of power would soon be overshadowed by an even greater tragedy. Because Samson was unaware that a far more dangerous trap was approaching, a trap that would ultimately seal his fate. In the Valley of Sorek, Samson's destiny changed forever. There, he met a woman named Delilah. She wasn't a warrior or a princess, but her cunning and manipulative nature were far deadlier weapons than any sword or spear. The man who could demolish armies with his bare hands found himself utterly defenseless against her captivating beauty. Samson, capable of killing 1,000 men, couldn't resist the allure of one woman. The Philistines saw this as the perfect opportunity and hatched a treacherous plan. The 5 Philistine lords approached Delilah with a tempting proposal. They offered her 1,100 silver shekels, over 14 pounds of pure silver, an enormous amount of money that could buy anyone's loyalty in those days. In exchange, all she had to do was discover the secret of Samson's extraordinary strength and how they could overpower him and bring him to justice. And Delilah, driven by insatiable greed, readily accepted the deal. Soon after, with feigned sweetness and innocent curiosity, she asked Samson directly, "Please tell me what makes you so incredibly strong and how you could be tied up and subdued." Samson, overconfident and toying with her, lied to her. "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that haven't dried yet," he said, "I'll become weak and be like any other man." That very night, while he was sleeping soundly, Delilah tied him up with the 7 new bowstrings. Philistine soldiers waited, hidden in the room, ready to strike at her signal. Then she shouted the agreed-upon signal, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He woke up instantly and snapped the bowstrings with astonishing ease, as if they were nothing more than strands of straw touched by a flickering flame. The secret remained safe. The first trap had failed miserably. Delilah didn't give up easily. She approached him again, pretending to be deeply hurt and offended by his deception. "You've deceived me and told me lies," she exclaimed. "Now, tell me the truth. What does it really take to make you weak?" Giving in a little more to her constant insistence, he gave her another false answer. "If you tie me tightly with new ropes that have never been used," he said, "then I'll become weak and powerless." The plan repeated itself. She obtained new ropes, tied him up while he slept, and once again shouted with all her might, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." Once more, he rose up effortlessly and snapped the ropes from his arms as if they were mere threads. The second attempt was another complete failure. Delilah's frustration grew with each failed attempt, but her determination to get her hands on that enormous fortune was even stronger, and for the third time, she pressured him relentlessly to reveal the secret of his incredible power. Samson gave her yet another false answer. "If you weave the 7 braids of my hair into the web of a loom and secure it tightly," he said, "then I'll be as weak as anyone else." She waited patiently for him to fall asleep and carefully wove his thick hair into the loom, securing it firmly in place. Then she shouted the usual alarm, "Samson, the Philistines are coming for you." He woke with a start and, with extraordinary strength, not only broke free from the loom, but ripped the entire loom right out of the wall and carried it off with him. 3 attempts, 3 failures. Delilah finally realized that these deceptive games weren't working, so she decided to change her strategy completely. Now, she would use her most powerful weapon, emotional manipulation. She began to cry and hurl accusations at him, questioning his love and his loyalty. "How can you say that you love me when you won't even trust me enough to tell me the truth?" she demanded. Her strategy was to break him down from the inside, to chip away at his resolve until he had nothing left. Day after day, her words were a constant torment, a relentless assault on his emotions. The pressure was so intense and so unrelenting that, as the scripture says, his soul was vexed unto death. Finally, Samson broke down completely and told her the whole truth, the secret of his consecration to God. "I have been a Nazirite since I was in my mother's womb," he confessed, revealing the core of his strength. He explained that a Nazirite was a person consecrated to God under a very special vow, a vow that included never cutting his hair. His long, flowing hair was the visible symbol of his covenant, his sacred agreement with God. If he broke that covenant, the consequences would be devastating. "If I am shaved," he said, "my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man." Delilah knew in her heart that he wasn't lying this time, and that this time he had given her his heart, his trust, completely. Then she sent an urgent message to the Philistine rulers. "Come at once," she wrote, "for he has finally revealed his whole heart to me." Samson, exhausted and trusting, fell asleep on her lap. The Philistines arrived, this time with the promised silver in their hands. It was a picture of perfect betrayal. While he slept, Delilah called for a man to shave off his 7 locks of hair. The first lock fell to the ground, then the second, then the third. With each lock that hit the ground, a 20-year vow was broken, until the last lock, the 7th, fell, and the covenant was shattered forever. The Bible describes it with a simple, terrible phrase, "and his strength left him." Delilah cried out one last time, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He woke up calmly, confident that he would escape as he had before, but he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. He tried to break free, but he couldn't. His strength was gone. Israel's hero was now just an ordinary man, stripped of his divine power. The Philistines seized him instantly, and in an act of unspeakable cruelty, gouged out his eyes, leaving him blind forever. Disoriented and helpless, they bound him with heavy bronze chains and dragged him to Gaza as a war trophy, a symbol of their victory. There, the man who had delivered Israel from their oppression was forced to grind grain in prison like a common slave, doing the work of animals. Thus, the judge of Israel, the strongest man of his time, became a spectacle of utter humiliation. But what the Philistines didn't realize was that there, in the darkness of the prison, Samson's true transformation was just beginning. He had lost his sight, his strength, and his freedom. but in losing everything he valued, he would finally learn. Here's the translated and rewritten text, expanded and elaborated upon as requested. What he had never truly understood before finally dawned on him. Real strength wasn't about bulging muscles or flowing hair, but about utter and complete reliance on God. As the days went by, Samson began to see that God hadn't taken away his strength simply because he lost his hair. It was because his faith in God had been shattered. He understood that he'd been playing games with the boundaries of his sacred vow for far too long, operating under the mistaken belief that God would always have his back, no matter what foolish thing he did. He was so very wrong. In the dark depths of his prison cell, Samson finally understood what had eluded him, even at the height of his power and glory. He discovered that his greatest weakness of all was living his life separated from God. The man who had always placed his confidence in his physical strength began, for the very first time, to truly surrender to the Lord's will. And then a true miracle occurred. His hair started to grow back again. It became a symbol of renewed hope, concrete proof that the covenant he had broken could be restored, that even a completely defeated man could rise up once again. The story wasn't finished. And in spite of everything that had happened, God still had a purpose for him. The Philistines, completely drunk on their recent victory, decided to throw a huge festival to honor their god, Dagon, a bizarre deity who was half fish and half man, and who they considered to be the father of Baal and a symbol of their prosperity. This wasn't just a religious celebration, though. It was a political statement, plain and simple. They wanted to broadcast to the entire world that Dagon had soundly defeated the God of Israel, that their strange idol had delivered into their hands the most feared judge that Israel had ever known. The temple was absolutely packed. Some 3,000 people crammed onto the roof and into the surrounding areas to witness the spectacle. All of the Philistine princes and leaders were there, the entire military and political elite, all gleefully celebrating what they genuinely believed was their ultimate and permanent victory over Israel. It was a national assembly, a massive party to celebrate the utter humiliation of their most hated enemy. The man who had haunted their nightmares for so long was now reduced to being their personal jester, there for their amusement. They commanded that Samson be brought out, and they dragged him into the center of the temple. Samson appeared, now completely blind, his eye sockets empty. He was so weakened that a young servant had to hold him up and guide him like a frail, old man. The whole scene was unbelievably humiliating. The hero who had once struck terror into their hearts now walked in chains, stumbling and groping, much to the delight of the jeering crowd. But then, as the crowd mocked and taunted him, Samson leaned in discreetly toward the boy who was leading him and whispered, "Place me where I can feel the pillars that hold up this temple so that I can lean against them." The boy, completely unaware of what was about to unfold, led him directly to the two massive pillars of wood and stone that supported the entire structure. This architectural design was common in Philistine temples, and it placed the full weight of the roof squarely on these two central columns. As he touched both pillars with his hands, Samson knew that he held in his arms not only the chance for vengeance for the loss of his eyes, but also the fate of all of Philistia. It was then, right in the middle of the temple's chaotic clamor, that Samson lifted up his final prayer, a desperate cry that pierced through the Philistines' cruel mockery and reached heaven itself. "Lord God," he prayed, "remember me now, and please strengthen me, I beg you, just this one last time, O God, so that I may at long last take vengeance on the Philistines for my two eyes." With these words, he revealed everything that he had learned through his brokenness and suffering. He finally recognized that the strength he possessed had never been his own, but God's, and he wasn't asking for a long and comfortable life, but for one final moment of power in the name of the Lord. Then he placed his right hand on one pillar and his left hand on the other. The noise of the celebration completely drowned out the murmur of his voice. He breathed deeply, feeling the cold, rough stone beneath his palms. And then, with a cry that thundered through the entire temple, he pushed with all his might, shouting, "Let me die with the Philistines." The two central pillars immediately began to crack and splinter. The roof shuddered violently, and in an instant, the laughter and celebration turned into screams of pure, unadulterated terror. The entire structure began to collapse in on itself. Stone and wood fell like a raging river of destruction. Dust filled the air, bodies were crushed and buried, and the crash shook the entire city to its very foundations. The two central pillars continued to crack, groaning under the immense pressure. The structure groaned for a moment and suddenly gave way. The roof, with its 3,000 spectators, crashed down on the leaders celebrating below. The entire structure was completely destroyed. The temple became a tomb of dust and death. The sounds of laughter and celebration turned into muffled cries of terror and pain. In a single instant, the political, military, and religious elite of Philistia was completely annihilated. The Bible summarizes the event with a stark and unforgettable phrase: "So he killed many more when he died than while he lived." His final act had a devastating strategic impact, far greater than all of his previous battles combined. But it came at a tremendous price. Samson died there, crushed beneath the rubble alongside his enemies. And through the sacrifice of his own life, he fulfilled the very mission he was born for, to begin delivering Israel from Philistine oppression. His death wasn't a defeat. It was the ultimate fulfillment of his destiny. The judge who had led Israel for 20 years with his final breath placed his trust in God once more and accomplished the very purpose for which he had been consecrated from his mother's womb. He will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. When the dust from the collapsed temple finally settled, his brothers and his father's entire household came down to Gaza to retrieve his body. They carried him home and buried him in his father's tomb in the land where he was born. They rested the man who had led Israel for 20 years. The man whose fall left a far deeper mark than all of his victories ever could. His story became etched in Israel's collective memory as a powerful and cautionary warning. A man may possess the most extraordinary gifts imaginable, but without faithfulness to God, those very gifts can become the seeds of his ultimate downfall. When Samson lost his physical eyes, he finally saw with spiritual clarity. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that without God, he was nothing. That true strength never resided in his hair or his muscles, but in his unwavering faith. What Samson could never achieve in his own strength, he ultimately accomplished in his weakness when he depended entirely on the Lord. His final prayer stands as a timeless testimony of unwavering faith, a cry that reminds us that trusting in the Lord, even in our darkest hour, is the greatest form of victory. And his death, a sacrifice made to save his people, became a distant echo of the redemption principle that, centuries later, would be perfectly and completely fulfilled in Christ. From Samson, we learn that weakness surrendered to God can be transformed into the greatest of victories. His life is a mirror reminding us just how fragile we all are, and that redemption doesn't always come at the peak of success. Sometimes it arrives in our darkest hour, when we feel like we have nothing left. It's never too late to put your trust in the Lord. And this story now calls out to you. Perhaps you too are at that point in your life where everything seems lost, where you feel you have no strength left, where your story seems to have reached its final, tragic end. But if you put your trust in the Lord, He can transform your brokenness into purpose, your fall into a valuable lesson, and your weakness into your greatest victory. It's crucial that if you know someone who needs to hear this message, you share this video with them. It could be exactly what they need to rise again and face the future with hope. Support this powerful teaching with a like, And if you don't know the story of Israel's wisest judge, Solomon, or of Isaiah, one of the most important prophets to whom God revealed the end times, I'm leaving their incredible biblical stories on screen for you. Blessings to you and your family.